Hey everybody. So today we're going to go over After Effects and animation. We're going to just start off with the basics of After Effects and how to use it. And then we're going to move into how to use it specifically for animating the more ephemeral or atmospheric aspects of landscape, things that are temporal, like seasonal changes or weather or meteorology or things like that. So I have After Effects open right now. And the first thing we're going to do is just talk through this interface. So as you can see, there's a few different panels here. The first panel I want to talk about is this one here, which is the project panel. The project panel is essentially where all of your raw graphic materials, your images or your videos that you want to pull in and start to layer together into an animation. This is where they all are going to sit. So it's essentially like your pantry. So it's where all your ingredients are, and then you can then pull them down into this panel here, which is your timeline, and start working with them. But I'm just going to show you how to import some files. So go up to the project panel over here and right click, and we're going to go to import file. I'm going to start off with two different files for now. I'm going to grab these. Now I'm going to grab this one and this one. We'll pull them in here. Okay, great. So yeah, you can see that as you continue to add more files, this kind of pantry of materials will begin to grow. The next thing we're going to do is actually to create a composition. And a composition is essentially a set of layered animated files that layer on top of one another and create an aggregate scene or animation scene. So we're going to go ahead and just click here and create a new composition. Pull this over for you guys to see. So let's name our composition. I'm going to call it ephemeral, because that's kind of what we're talking about today. So you can see that here you can set your aspect ratio, and you can set your frame rate, and you can set your duration. So there's some presets here. Typically, I choose this HDTV 1080, which seems to be a pretty good default for posting out on most platforms, YouTube and things like that. So our aspect ratio is 1920 to 1080. We're going to just keep all of this the same. You want your frame rate for most projects to be 30, or like this is almost 30, and it's both fine. Frame rates can vary depending on the vibe that you want to create. I think a lot of cinema uses 24 frames per second, which is a little bit more of a cinematic quality. For most animations and stuff that you'll be doing, about 30 frames per second is the best way to go. You can choose a different background color than black. We're going to leave that. And then the last thing we're going to do is we'll set our duration here. And just so you guys are aware, these first two numbers here are actually your frames. So if we have 30 frames per second, then this will only go up to 30. And then this is seconds, this is minutes, and this is hours. So right now we have a 10-second clip, which you would probably increase if you were going to have a longer animation. But for today and what I'm going to be showing you guys, it will be fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that now our composition has shown up here in the project panel. So every time you create a composition, it will show up here as something that you can then place within another composition. So think of compositions as just like essentially groupings of animated layers that can be placed within one another, and so on. So it's also opened it up down here in our timeline, but we don't have any layers. So I'm going to go ahead and pull both of these images that I have down into our timeline, and you'll see now our timeline is populated with these rectangles because both of these images last for the entire scene. I can move this down and sort of clip this first top image here, which is a picture of a mine in Indonesia. And you can also see that this image is quite a bit bigger than what our aspect ratio that we chose. And so I'm just going to grab this and hold Shift to keep the ratio the same. And I'm just going to resize this down a little bit so more of the image fits. And we can turn this one off over here. You can also lock these if you don't want to risk changing something. I'm just going to turn this off and look at this one. And you can see that this one is also a little bit bigger than the frame. And so I'm just going to also reduce this one down to about there. And so you remember that I clipped this. And so as we travel along in our timeline, you'll notice that once we get to that mark where that is clipped, oh, sorry, this isn't on. 1 second. If you turn this back on, then you'll see, so this is the image that's on top. And it's a clipped image. We've clipped it to disappear after about 1 second, and there we go. And you can hit the space bar. This is, while this is your timeline, this would be your preview panel. So this is where you'll be able to see a rendered preview of what you're animating. And if you hit the space bar, your timeline will play, and you can watch a preview of your animation. This here is your looping bar. So right now the looping bar is set for the entire 10-second animation. But if I move this down to like 2 seconds, and then we come back here and I hit spacebar to preview, it will essentially loop through only those 2 seconds. And we'll keep this, maybe we'll keep this at like 3 seconds for now. And then this other one up here is how much of your timeline is shown. So right now we have all 10 seconds of the timeline shown in our timeline area, but you may want to at some point get into the nitty-gritty of adjusting just a few frames or something. And so with that you can pull this top one, and this sort of zooms into the timeline, and you can get into the nitty-gritty of your timeline in that way. So this looks pretty, maybe we'll extend this a little bit, something like that. And that'll be good for us for right now. So we have our project panel, we have our timeline, we have our preview panel, and then over here, this has a few things. This is a few different things, but the one that is the most important is that over here is the effects library. So the effects are really the bread and butter of After Effects, hence the name, and adding various effects is really what allows you to do a lot of really cool animations. And there's a ton of effects built into After Effects that have kind of like grown through the years and through different versions. And there's almost so many that nobody really like. You almost just kind of have to start digging through and playing with them, because you'll always find cool new things. But if you first of all, you'll notice that this is kind of a cramped workplace, right? Like you may, as this starts to get pretty long, you may feel kind of cramped over here. As your timeline starts to get pretty populated, you may feel like this isn't enough room to really see what you're doing. So one thing you can do is you can hover over one particular panel and then hit the tilde key, which is like that swirly that goes over an N in like Spanish and stuff. It's right under the escape key. And then that will zoom into one specific panel. So I can hover over this and that will zoom in here. And then you just hit it again and then you can zoom back out. So yeah, that is the layout that we're working with. And let's see, what else do we want to do next? So let's start to create some basic animations. I'm going to pull this back up and extend it. But every time you pull down a layer, you will see that there are a number of default characteristics that you can change here. So you can change the anchor point, which is essentially the center. You can change the position of this. I can move this around and you can see that this is moving. I can change the scale. I can make this bigger or smaller. I can rotate it. Woohoo! And I can also change the opacity, so I can have this fade down, right? And so changing any one of these, if I change this opacity to 50%, let's say, this will change this all the way through the animation. But what I'm going to show you guys how to do is to animate this so that it changes over time. And the way we're going to do that is with keyframes, which are basically the basic markers of animation in After Effects. They're essentially points at which a transition in a characteristic happens. And so what we're going to do is, the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to show you a fade between these two images. So let's set this back to 100 for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to set a keyframe by clicking on this little stopwatch here. And we're at the beginning of our timeline. We'll just hit a little stopwatch. And you can see now that I have a little diamond here. So that's our keyframe. And if I go a little forward in time to, let's say, 2 seconds, and I set this to 0, I'm automatically going to get another keyframe down here. Every time that you change a value over here, you're going to get an automatic keyframe. If you want to change the value of a specific keyframe, you can just hover over where that keyframe is and you can change it. But what we're going to see, I did this backwards, but if we preview this over 2 seconds, the opacity of this top image is going to fade from 100% to 0. And you can see that there. So that's just one of the things you can do. You know, I could animate this to I could animate this top image to, you know, slowly zoom in or something by just hitting a keyframe here, moving this further down, zooming in. Maybe I'll just do it really quick, coming down here and making this even bigger. And you'll see this will both zoom in and go away because we have both of the characteristics keyframed at the same time, so that's additive. See that? It's zoomed in and disappearing. So that's just basic animation. I'm going to get rid of these because we don't actually want that to happen. And let's see. This guy's now out of scale, so I'm going to bring this back to 100 like it was before, and scale it back in to what we want. Okay, great. So yeah, so that's very basic animation. You can see that this layer has the exact same transform options. These are the basic ones that come with any layer. So you don't need to add an effect to have these characteristics available to you for animation. But we're gonna now add our first effect. So we're gonna work with this image of this gold mine, this satellite image of this gold mine a little bit later. But I'm gonna just focus on this pretty forest picture for right now. So the first thing that I want to show you guys is some color correction options. So color correction is a really good way of animating like a seasonal change, or animating a change from daytime to nighttime, or something like that. And there's a number of different effects that allow you to do color correction. So let me show those to you now. So I'm going to click on this layer and we're going to add an effect to it. And so we want to make sure that it's selected. And then you can either search for an effect over here, or we can go up here to Effect. And I'm going to go to Color Correction. And then I'm going to choose, for this one, I'm going to choose Selective Color. And you'll see, if you are familiar with Photoshop, you'll see that there are a number of effects that are similar to things in Photoshop, so very basic things like brightness and contrast, or hue and saturation, auto color, these things. But then there are some more interesting ones down in here as well. And so anyway, I'm going to do a selective color. And what I want to do is I want to animate a change from summer into fall. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go over here, and there's an option here, drop down list of all these different colors that I can target. And so I want to change the color of the leaves. So I'm going to target the yellows and the greens of this image. So first I'm going to go to the yellows, I'm going to crank the magenta way up, and you can see we have a little bit of change there, and then I'm going to drop the cyan down quite a bit. And so we start to get a little bit of oranging, yellowing. I'm also going to hit the greens, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to crank the magenta up pretty good, and then I'm going to drop this cyan down quite a bit. And you can see we now have this lovely fall scene, right? And so, oh, you know what? So one thing that is helpful when working with effects, some effects you can keyframe by themselves, but selective color is actually one that you can't keyframe on its own. So when working with a lot of adjustments, something that's good to do actually, and I should have mentioned this before, is instead of putting the effect directly onto this layer, one thing we can do is to add an adjustment layer above this layer, and then you can add multiple effects to that layer, and then it will affect all of the layers below it. So let me show you that. So let's actually get rid of this for right now. Sorry about that. And we're going to go to Layer, and we're going to go to New, and we're going to go to Adjustment Layer. So now we have a new adjustment layer that's above our scene, and I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it Seasonal Change. Okay, and you can see that nothing happened. It's just like a totally transparent layer. But we're gonna go back and we're gonna add the selective color to this again here, and we're gonna go to our yellows, up the magenta, decrease the cyan. Same with the greens, up the magenta, decrease the cyan. Okay, and so now we have this lovely transition. You can see what a difference that makes. And so what we can do is with this on, and you'll also notice that the way you can change the settings of each effect both up here. So the effect controls also populates the same window as the project panel. The project panel is still here. There's a tab for it right here, so you can switch between these two. You can also access the details for the effect that you have down here as well. So I typically like to work up here, and so now that we have this on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe the opacity of this adjustment. So if we go to the start and we set the opacity to 0, we won't be able to see the adjustment, but we will be able to see the image below it. I'm going to put a keyframe here by clicking on the stopwatch, and then I'm going to go 2 seconds later, and I'm going to change this to 100. Okay, and then if we go to the start here and we hit the space bar to preview, then that will slowly come into view and we'll slowly get a change into fall. So yeah, pretty slick. So that is one way that you can use color correction to indicate some sort of temporal change or some sort of seasonal change. I'm also going to show you guys, let's click this picture of the mine, and I'm going to show you guys how to simulate like a transition from daytime to nighttime. So let's do best practice and let's add another adjustment layer above it, and let's rename it so we know what it is. I'm going to call this day to night. Great. And so on this adjustment layer, I'm going to go to Effect, I'm going to go to Color Correction. This time I'm going to add a photo filter. So let's add this, and you can see it automatically adds a warming filter. If I toggle this on and off, you can see just a slight change here. And so there's a number of options here. I can do a red filter, I can do like a deep red, which is a little bit more. I can do a deep blue, something like this. I'm going to choose a custom color, so I'm going to go to Custom, and then I'm going to choose kind of like a dark grayish blue kind of nighttime color. So we're going to go ahead and click OK, and then we're going to uncheck this Preserve Luminosity, and then we're going to change this density to be quite a bit more until we get something that we like that's pretty dark. So I like that. That's indicative to me of nighttime for the most part. And so we can then go down here and we can animate the opacity of this layer as well. So we can set this to 0 at the start, and we'll put a little keyframe here. And then let's say maybe 1 second later, there's a transition to nighttime. So this adjustment layer is now at 100% opacity. We need to leave it at nighttime for a little bit. So let's leave it at nighttime for 1 second. We'll go to 2 seconds and we'll add another keyframe over here. So this entire time between these, it will be at 100% opacity. And then we'll go over here, and then at 3 seconds, we'll set another keyframe back to 0, back to daytime. And so if I go to the start here and I press spacebar to preview, we'll get this darkening transition to nighttime. And then it'll be nighttime for a little while. And then it will lighten back up again. And you can play around with this. You can refine this. You could even, add a few different photo filters that are animated at different times. So like for a little while, it starts to transition to something more orange. So you get like a sunset moment here, and then it gets dark into like a bluish purple, and then it stays that way. And then there's like a sunrise moment where it transitions back to orange, and then that all fades away and you have a crystal clear day or something like that. So you can continue adding these and refining these to make it more realistic, but I'm just showing you just kind of like a basic technique to get you started. So those are two really interesting color correction options that you can do. Let me show you just a few others. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this adjustment layer for right now so we're not looking at it, as well as this one. So a few other really powerful effects. Sometimes you use Lumetri color. This is a very professional color correction thing. It has a lot of things inside it, and it can get confusing really fast. But if you just spend some time with it, then you'll see that it's very, very powerful. So it has basic correction here. We can change the white balance. We can change the exposure. If I turn this back on, we can change. I'm going to turn this guy off. If we can change the exposure of this image. We can change the contrast, maybe. Doesn't seem to want to be doing it for some reason. Oh, that's because it's at 0. Ha. Oh, so there's our exposure. So let me go back really quick. So okay, so now that this is on, so we can change the exposure of this. We can change the highlights, bring those up, bring the shadows down a little bit, get something nice and contrasty. We can change the whites and blacks. We can change the saturation. We can pick a tint for the shadow. We can get some kind of blue shadow. We can pick a tint for the highlights and get some yellow highlights. There's a lot of really cool things that you can end up doing with Lumetri color. So just have a look at it, just start playing around with it. That's really the best way to learn about all of these effects, is to just change every single one of the settings and see what you get. But that's a really powerful one that you might want to look into. The other one I find that's fun is called Change Color To, or Change to Color, excuse me. And what that one does is you can select a color. So let's select like the blue of this pond down here, and you can change that to something really wild, and then you can that wasn't a good example because there's not a lot of that color. Let's actually add that down to this one here. So let's add a new adjustment layer. I'm going to go ahead and add this change to color. And let's select this green, and then we can get a really crazy change of color here just by changing this color. See that? So that's really fun. But as you saw with the one before, typically if you need to have a pretty good amount of that color to really see a difference. But that one's a really fun one to use as well. So anyway, those are just a few different color correction options that I like to use that can help you to create seasonal or temporal changes within your scene. So yeah, I'm going to get rid of that, and let's move on. So another thing you can do that is somewhat related to color correction is there are a lot of, one of the things we're going to be talking about later in the video is like how to animate like clouds and fog and fire and things like this. And while we can make a lot of those in After Effects, many people have already made these, and you can get green screen footage of clouds or fire or things like that, and just you can find them on YouTube and you can download them, and then you can just pull them in and get rid of the green, and you already have like an animated cloud over top of your thing. So I'm going to show you that right now. I'm going to go back to the project panel. I'm going to import a file. Oh, I don't actually have, well, here, let me show you. Okay, so let's get a new window. We can go to YouTube and we can just search for cloud, cloud green screen. And we can choose this one right here, which is great. We'll copy the thing here. We'll find a YouTube downloader. Use like this one. And we'll paste her in. And we'll download it. Great. So now we can import this file in here. So go to our downloads and bring this guy in. Great. So let's pull this down into our timeline. We'll put it on the top. Let's scale it up. Great. If we preview this, you'll see a cloud slowly moving by in this video. So there's one effect that is fairly new that's really powerful for green screening. It's called key light. And so you can type that in and we can press that here. We'll make sure to select the video layer and then go ahead and double click on this. And so what key light does is you can then take the this eyedropper under screen color and select this green, and boom, that's now gone, but your desired pixels, your cloud pixels, are still there. And so now we automatically have like some clouds moving across this landscape, which is really slick. So that's green screening. I'm going to get rid of this, but that's one way of doing that. The next thing I want to show you guys is just understanding a little bit more about layers and masks. So something I want to show you, something I want to do here is let's animate. This is a quarry here. This is like a big hole in the ground. Let's say if we had some clouds going over top, there would be some rainfall, and the quarry would like fill up with water. So let's animate that actually happening. So how I'm going to do that is first I'm going to select a solid layer. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, and Solid. And I'm going to name it, and I'm going to name it Pond. And it's set to be blue right now. Yours might be set to be black. It doesn't matter. We're going to change it anyway. And we'll just go ahead and click OK. Okay, so now we have this solid layer. So I want to create a mask on this layer, so only a portion of this is showing. And that's what a mask does, is it's essentially just a defined boundary in which a certain amount of a certain portion of the layer is shown and the other portion is not. So I want to trace that onto here. So I'm just going to put the opacity of this down so I can see my image below, so I can trace this. So let's go ahead and just very roughly and quickly trace the outlines of this pond. Oops. Sorry. It's not exact. If you were being more exact, you would better follow the contour lines here, especially since with a mine, they are very visible because they're doing things in sections. So once I close this, you'll notice that this becomes a mask. So all the area outside of it is now not visible, but everything inside of it is. And we can change this. We can go into, you can see that now a mask was created under this layer. And here it is. And we can change this right here to say subtract. And then that's the inverse. So now everything that's outside of the mask is what's showing. But we want add, of course. And I'm also going to, just to give this some realisticness with the color, like, you know, it looks okay now. It's kind of a pond. But just to give this some realisticness, I'm going to add a gradient to this. So I'm going to select my layer, and I'm going to search for gradient, and I'm going to do a gradient ramp. Okay, so you can see that now there's this black to white gradient, which is over here. So instead of a linear gradient, we want a radial gradient. And we're going to move the center of this gradient into the center of our pond, something like that. And then we're going to make the edges of this gradient a little bit smaller so it's more focused. And then we're going to change this start color to maybe like a very deep kind of teal color, something like that maybe. And then the outside we're going to have be a lighter kind of bluish, something like that. Maybe I'll make this a little bigger. And so if we bring this opacity up, you can see that that's what we have now. And you can either, you know, kind of leave the opacity low so that you can get a little see-through, and it's, you know, it's like the water see-through. The other thing you can do is right-click on this layer and go to blending mode. And I'm gonna choose multiply. You may be familiar with blending modes from Photoshop. It's just a number of different ways of like calculating additions and subtractions and multiplications of overlapping pixels. But I'm going to do multiply, and then what we have is kind of this see-through colorized sort of section here. So now we have this wonderful pond. So great. So one thing we might do with it is we might give it a little bit of a, within every mask has a few different characteristics that it comes with that you are able to animate. So we might put a little feather on this. You know, the edges of it are pretty strong right now, so we might put just a slight feather on it. Maybe make that look a little bit more realistic, you know? And so we want to essentially, one thing I mean, the easiest way of doing this, obviously, is that we can just animate the opacity of this layer, and we can have this be at 0, you know, and then a little bit later, you know, this is now 100, or whoops, remember to put a keyframe. So we'll put a keyframe at, actually, I'm having a little difficulty. Put a keyframe here. Okay. And then a little bit later, we'll have this be at 100. And then, you know, this slowly fills up with water. But that's not super realistic. That's just very figurative and gestural. And so Another way we can make this kind of fill up from the center here is by using this mask expansion. So mask expansion, it essentially rules like how much of this area is filled in. And so if I crank this up, you'll see that it starts to bleed out of the area. But if I crank this down, you'll see, oh, it goes down to the center. So what I can do is I can animate this and put a keyframe here when this is very, very small. And then a little bit later, I can bring this back to 0 pixels, so it's right on the line. And then what we'll get is this slowly filling up. Nice. And to just give this a little bit more of a realistic flair, another thing we're going to do is called the turbulent display. I'm going to turn this feather off just so you can see this, because what I'm going to be doing is transforming the edges of this shape. So we'll add that back in. But for now, I just want to show you what this effect is going to do, because we're going to use this effect a lot. So I'm going to select my layer, and I'm going to search for turbulent displace, and go ahead and add it. And you can see already that the edges of this kind of got a little bit warped, and that's exactly what this does. So by changing the different settings here, you can get some warping of a specific shape. So if I change the amount, you can see that the kind of amount of warping on the edges starts to change. And if I crank this up a lot, you can see this almost starting to like spread out like that. We don't obviously want that much for this particular thing, but what we do want to do is, as this is you know, filling this, we want it to kind of like start to like stretch out and find the holes and find the gaps in the contours, and so we want it to like wiggle a little bit essentially as it's growing. And so we can start to kind of like play around with this. This is, if we have the amount here, this is the size of that, so how big those kind of undulations are. This is the complexity of it, so it's kind of the fine grainness of those things. So you can see how that starts to look kind of watery if that was an effect you were going for. But you know, for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to have this. Let's put these back down a little bit. We're just going to have this be a ever so slight kind of filling up. And then what we can do now is we can use this evolution. And what this evolution does is it just kind of iterates the displacement. And so as I move this, you'll see that this kind of like undulates a little bit. And so that's a way that you can get things to sort of kind of ripple and move over time. And so in addition to having this fill out, let's bring this back down right now to 0, 0. Let's set a keyframe here at 0, and then we'll go over here, and let's have this go through like, you know, 1 revolution, which isn't too much change, but it's maybe just enough. Oh, it looks like our amount is maybe a little too much, because it's a little bit outside of our boundary here. We don't want to get too crazy. But that's going to add a nice subtle sort of movement as we go along here. I'm going to up the complexity a little bit too. So let's throw this, let's go back here. I just want to throw this feather back on here. And let's preview this. And so we get this, it's kind of being a little sticky, but you can see it's sort of like moving into the gaps in the areas a little bit more naturally than it was before with that turbulent displacement. So that's a very subtle way of using turbulent displacement. But if we wanted to, we can really crank, I'm just going to make this black for a second. We can really crank up the settings here. if we crank up the amount quite a bit, you can see that this starts to break apart like this. And then if we crank up the complexity, we get this sort of thing. And so how that can be useful is, I'm going to just set these back to what they were. But if you had, for instance, a puddle that you wanted to disappear, what you can do is you could set keyframes for the complexity and the amount at this point, and then a little bit later on you could have the amount crank up pretty strongly and the complexity crank up pretty strongly. And you can also have this masked expansion go pretty small. And then what you would get is this effect that this puddle was sort of drying up, right? Maybe it's better actually to just to not even animate the complexity, to just have this amount and this complexity up a little bit, and then you could animate the evolution of this and then also have it decrease, and it would sort of dry up. So that's another way of using turbulent displace. I'm going to show you another way of using turbulent displace, but instead of doing water, we're going to do some clouds. So to do that, I'm going to pull in another image. I'm going to import and file. This time I'm going to pull in something called Pollen noise, which is just kind of like a randomized pixelation of grayscale values. I'll show you what it, oh, didn't mean to do that. Was a little trigger happy, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to go in here. So I'm going to grab my Pollen noise. I'm going to pull this in. Great. And I'm going to scale this up so it fills this thing. And so like I said, this is just kind of a randomized pixelation of grayscale values. And you can just Google Pollen noise and copy any one of these images in. But what these are useful for is they just offer like a nice texture that you can manipulate, and instead of using a solid color, it makes things have a little bit more depth to them. So you can use them for a lot of things, and animators do use them for a lot of things. So first, what we're going to do, we want to create some clouds out of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make another mask. And what I really want is I just want like this nice big blob. Oh wait, sorry. I added a shape layer because I didn't have this selected. So first select your layer and then draw on it, and that will draw a mask on it. So we just want something nice and blobby. And I know this is not really looking like a cloud right now, but I promise you it will start to look better. We just want a lot of surface area. There we go. Okay, so yeah, this looks pretty weird now, I agree. Not really a cloud necessarily, but we are going to fix that. And so we're going to click back on this, and we're going to add, sorry, I'm just going to decrease my window a little bit. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. Just having some trouble grabbing the bottom. Okay, so we're going to add another turbulent displace. We're going to increase the amount to about 100, And then we're going to increase the complexity quite a bit. We're going to increase this up to maybe 5. Okay, so now we start to get something that looks pretty wonky. And so if we, if I just go through an evolution of this really quickly, you can see that this change is already, pretty provocative. Right now we can imagine that this, as the way it is maybe like an oil slick or something. And if we were to blur this a little bit, we could get some different types of things. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make sure that our clouds layer is selected, and let's add a Gaussian blur. You can also find this by going to Effect. Well, yeah. You could also do it by going to Effect and Blur and Gaussian blur. But anyway, if we add a little bit of a blur to this, then we start to get something, we don't see those edges quite so much, and so maybe it looks a little bit more like storm clouds now developing across our page. And if we really crank this up, or maybe this is, maybe this is not quite clouds yet, maybe this is more like smoke or something. It's got a little bit more definition to it. But if we really crank this up to maybe like 100, then we can see us starting to get some, something that's a lot more cloudy. And so really just with adding different blurs and feathers and turbulent displacement, you can get a lot of different scenarios. Like, let's say we get rid of this blur for a second, and let's go back to this. If I recolor this in some sort of way, so let's say, let's add a hue saturation effect to this, and let's colorize it. We'll crank the saturation up, and we'll change it to something. Whoops. Something blue. And so now when we do the evolution, you can see that this is almost kind of like the surface of water or something. So you could animate, water movement or the top of water shimmering or something just by adding a blue color. You also probably saw that, if this is more of a, let's find a kind of an orangey yellow color here, and we do that, like maybe that's lava oozing out of a volcano or something. I mean, these things are not quite there, but what I'm just trying to show you is that if you go through these settings and you refine things a little bit more, you can get something that looks pretty realistic. But turbulent displacement, just by messing with the settings, you can get a lot of different really cool effects. We're going to get rid of these colors. I'm also going to turn this blur back on because what we really want are these clouds. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I want to kind of like animate this storm cloud moving across here, and also like kind of picking up strength or developing. So in order to do that, we want to keyframe 3 things. So we want to keyframe the position. So I'm just going to change the position here. I'm going to move this, maybe I can move it by hand, all the way over here. And I'm going to set a keyframe for the position. And then I'm going to move this 3 seconds out, and I'm going to drag this over all the way to the other end. And you can see that there is now a line here, which you could edit. Oops, I need to do that. You can essentially kind of like draw a path of movement, but for this we're just going to do a straight line. But you can see now that we've already got this animating so that it moves across the screen here. So we've got some clouds moving across, which is great. We want them billowing and undulating like we had before, which means we need to animate the evolution. So let's bring this all back to 0. Let's set a keyframe at the start of our thing. Let's go down to this 3-second mark, and let's have this go through like 4 revolutions or something. And what that is going to do is it's going to have this now kind of like undulating and moving. You can see that, so there's a little bit more animism and dynamism to the clouds as they go by. And then the last thing, oops, that I want to do is to animate these kind of like growing in size. So how we're going to do that, I'm going to pull this in the middle just to show you, and then I'm going to move it back off screen where it needs to be. But we could do that with, like I said before, the mask expansion. So if we bring this down, you know, we're going to get a lot less clouds or something. So that's about the amount of clouds I want at the start. So let's hit a keyframe there. Let's go to the middle somewhere and kind of like figure out how much we want it to show when it's sort of covering the thing. So let's up this a little bit, something maybe like that, almost, you know. And then towards the end, maybe like there, we want this to like really crank up. We want there to really have been like a storm brewing or something. And yeah, let's preview this and let's see how it looks. Hit this and hit play. So you can see this is, the clouds are starting to build, they're getting more and more, and then towards the end here they really start to thicken up as they pass over. That's probably a little fast. I might actually extend this these keyframes out so that it's not just over 3 seconds, but you generally get the idea that now we have some animated clouds here. So yeah, so Pollen noise can be great for textures like storm clouds, you know, lava, things that we talked about before. You can also just do this. I'm going to turn our clouds off. You can also just do this with a solid layer. So if I go to layer, new, solid, let's make some just like some mist or some fog or something. So I just want this to be white. And I'm going to press OK. We've got this white layer. I'm going to go back to our mask that we used before. I'm just going to copy it, Control C, and then I'm going to paste it onto this layer here. You can see that this pastes a little bit smaller. That's because our Pollen clouds were scaled up quite a bit, so the mask is proportional to the dimension of the image, and so our layer is a little bit smaller this time. So I'm just going to scale our mask, scale the whole thing up a little bit. And I'm going to reset the mask expansion to 0. It was less because we had copied it from the other thing. So let's go ahead and add one more turbulent displacement. Sorry. Let's add it to this layer here. And let's crank up the amount quite a bit, get this nice and disparate. And let's crank up the complexity quite a bit. We get something nice and wispy. And then let's add a lot of feather to the mask here. Let's just really crank this up. Great. So now we've got this really nice, just kind of misty light cloud type situation. And then we can just have this sort of sitting, billowing on top of this setting by animating the evolution. So I can click a keyframe here in the evolution, and then I can move this down, and I can have this billow, maybe, you know, 3 things or whatever, and then we just sort of get this kind of foggy meteorological sort of phenomena over top of all of this. So yeah, I don't want to push the turbulent displace too much, but there are a lot of things you can do with it, and so I would definitely check out that effect. Okay, I'm gonna rename this just for my own worth. We'll call it fog. We're gonna get rid of it, or we're gonna make it non-visible because we want to do some other things here. So turbulent displacement is great. Another one that y'all can use, or there are a number of other effects that After Effects has that are also really powerful. The next few I'm going to show you are really, really easy. They almost like do everything for you. And in order to show you it completely, I'm going to create a new solid layer. And I want to have it be black just so I can show you what this looks like. I'm just doing this to show you, to have a good background for it. So we're going to create some rainfall, and we're going to do that by just searching for rainfall and choosing CC rainfall. Make sure your layer is selected. And so you might be able to see, depending right now, that if I move my cursor, there's a little bit of rainfall on the screen. And I'm going to really crank this up, just depending on the screen and the light levels of where you're watching this. But I'm going to crank the size of these raindrops up quite a bit so you can start to see them. And I'm going to crank the opacity up a little bit. So now you really should be able to see this, and you should be able to see it raining. So this is a pretty hard thunderstorm. We can change the color of these. Maybe we want like this crazy magenta rainstorm or something. I don't know. We can add wind to this, and it can pull us in one direction, almost like a hurricane. And if I preview that, now we have this like magenta hurricane of rain coming down. And so you can play around with all these settings, and you can get a stronger or a lighter. You can get a drizzle, or you can get a hurricane, or whatever you want. There is a CC drizzle, and there's also a CC snowfall. The snowfall is exactly like this one, except it's snow, it's smaller particles. So go ahead and check those out as well. But those ones are super easy and really powerful for changing a setting of a scene. And the next thing I want to show you guys, I'm going to go to New, and I'm going to add another solid layer. We'll make it black. So the next thing I want to show you guys is particle systems. And particle systems are another really powerful effect in a lot of animation softwares, but they're in After Effects as well. And so we're going to search for particle, select our layer, search for particle, and we want CC Particle Systems 2. And what this is going to do is this is going to add, let me turn this back on actually. We're going to turn this rainfall off. That way there's a good background for it. So what this is going to do is this is going to add a particle generator. So you can see that there. Yeah! So that's pretty fun. And these are really powerful for creating all types of particulate animations. So everything from sandstorms to dust to pollen to fire to bubbles, all these kinds of things. And we're going to go through the settings. I'm not going to show you how to do any one thing specifically, but the settings are really powerful. There's a number of videos on YouTube of people doing all kinds of really cool things with particle systems. But let me show you the basics. So all particle systems have an origin or a producer from which all the particles are born. So I can move this producer down to the bottom of my thing here, and you can do that manually here as well. I'm going to click on physics here. So I'm going to change the animation type here. There's a number of different ones. This can twirl. You can create like a vortex or something. Wow. So you can get tornado animations if you want. I'm going to change this one to fire. And so that one's up from the bottom, and you get something like this. I'm going to extend this guy up a little bit so it's extending the full length, full area of my image. So we can change the velocity, we can make these go faster, we can change the gravity, which sort of like also has to do with the velocity. It's the kind of, obviously, you know, how much weight is being put on these particles as they float upwards. We can change the direction, so we can make this kind of swirl in the opposite direction. You can get kind of like a vortexy sort of situation that way as well. And we can change extra, which is sort of like the width of this, essentially. So we have some fire here, and we have some fire because the colors of these two things are are upon birth down here, they're yellow, and then they start to fade towards a red as they die. You can change the colors here. We could have this be green at the start and whatever. The other thing I want to show you guys is the particle type. So we have a bunch of lines right now. We can choose bubbles, and then you have bubbles coming up, so you might change them to blue or something. And then you get some nice underwater bubbles from a thermal vent, or who knows what. We can change this to like a tetrahedron or something. They have these, and then kind of make these smaller or whatever. And then we get, I don't know what this is, an explosion of some sort. Let's move this back up to the center here. Let's change the animation back to explosive. And yeah, now we get something kind of like coming out of the center here. We can change the gravity down to 0 so that this sort of splays out in all directions rather than going down. And you can see how maybe this could be like a pollen animation or something. You could have a flower here, and then you could have pollen sort of like bursting from it. So there's all kinds of really cool stuff that you can do with particle systems. I'm not going to get into any one specific thing because I want to keep this video shorter. It's already getting kind of long. But please look online for different things that people are doing with particle systems. Look for animating fire, look for animating sand and dust and all kinds of things. There's lots of good tutorials on YouTube. One other one maybe that I want to show you guys though is like this faded thing here, which has really cool, can have kind of like bursts or something, which is kind of nice. Anyway, so that's particle systems. Let's go back to our mine. And so there's two things I want to show you guys. The second to last thing I want to show you guys is how to animate paths. So you may have the vector lines of wind or the vector lines of water that you want to animate. And so I'm gonna draw some of those super quickly now. It won't look that good, but you'll get the idea. So I'm gonna go to Layer and New, and this time, instead of a solid or an adjustment layer, I'm gonna choose a shape layer. And so this is essentially a transparent layer that we can draw a shape onto. So there's this shape tool here where you can do kind of these preset shapes, but I'm gonna just draw some lines. And so let's animate like some water lines sort of maybe coming down this mountain and into this, this quarry pond that we've decided we're going to animate. So there's one. Let's see, here's two. And then we'll have maybe two on this side as well. So you see these have a fill now. That's okay. I'm going to get rid of it in just a second. And I'll show you how. Oops. Oops, come on. Got to unclick it and then start a new shape. Okay. So now, if we go down to the shape layer and we open this up and we go to the contents, now we have these 4 shapes. So these are all our lines and they're all under this one layer. So I'm going to go down to the fill and I'm going to change the opacity of all these fills to 0. That way, we only have the stroke. Okay. Great. So now we've got our strokes. We can select all of these, and then up here we could change the stroke color to blue or something. I don't actually want to do that. I kind of like this color. We can change how thick these are. I think they're kind of fine the way they are. Whatever, it's fine. And so yeah, so the way we're going to animate these, the way we're going to kind of have these draw online in real time is we're going to add a shift path. So if you go back to the shape layer and under contents to the right here, there's a number of things you can add to a shape layer that are kind of special shape layer effects. And one of them that we're going to do is called trim paths. So you can see now we have these options for trim paths down here. And so what this does is it allows you to set where the start and the end points for the visible portion of these lines is. So let me explain this a little bit better. If I move the start point of this from 0, which is the actual start of the line, upwards, you'll see that where we started these lines, it starts to disappear. And now that I'm all the way up to 100, you can see none of it because the end is also at 100. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to animate the end of this. So we're going to animate the end of this to be at 0. That way these lines kind of like coil up all the way up to the start, and we'll go to the start of our animation and we'll hit a keyframe, and then we'll go over here to maybe 2 seconds, and we'll have the end extend all the way down to the very end to 100%. And now if we go here and we hit preview, now these draw online or on the screen in real time. So that's a really good way of doing that. You can also draw lines in Illustrator and then bring them in to After Effects, and all you usually have to do is to convert them to actual After Effects shapes, which isn't very difficult to do at all. If you have the handout for this video tutorial, there is a link to a video that you can do that, and I'll put a link to that video down in the comments or down in the description of this video as well, because I'm not going to cover that, but it's fairly simple to move from Illustrator to After Effects as well. Okay, so that is all the things I want to show you, except for one last thing, which is very important, which is how to render out a video. So let's go back to our clouds. Let's say this is the animation that we want. Let's preview it again real quick. Yeah, I like that. Clouds building up, moving past. Like I said, I would probably refine this if we had a little bit more time. I would stretch this out and make them move a little slower and more lazily, but it's fine. So for rendering out a video, you have two options. You can either render in-house, which means that you use the render engine that After Effects has built in within it. And the other option is to use Adobe Media Encoder. So Media Encoder is a separate program that Adobe created specifically for rendering, and it's a lot more powerful than any of the render engines that the programs have built in within them. You can choose either option. I tend to go with the Media Encoder because it has all these really great presets. So if you are if you know that you're going to post on YouTube, or you're going to post on Twitter, or you're going to post on Instagram or Vimeo or whatever, the Media Encoder has all of these presets that allow you to choose exactly where you're going to post it, and then it primes it for that specific place. That way you get the best quality for that particular platform that you're going to post on. So let me show you that. So for rendering any video, you're going to make sure that you've got your composition that you want in here selected, and you're going to go to File, and you're going to go to Export, and you can see here we can either add to Adobe Media Encoder queue or to the render queue. And we want the Media Encoder, so I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and it will start to open Adobe Media Encoder, which I'll show you in just a second. Give me one moment. Okay. Great. So I'm going to pull this over. Now, I have had a little trouble getting this to add itself over, but I'm going to try again for you guys. So I'm going to try this one more time. I'm going to export this and add it to the Adobe Media queue. See if it will do it. What should happen is it would show up here. Don't always know why it's not. Um, oh, here we go. Just had to be patient. So I have 2 copies of it. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to go ahead and remove this one. Okay, so we have a few options here. First we have, oh, 1 second. So one of the things that Media Encoder does is it creates a dynamic link between your project and Media Encoder itself. So so the first thing I did was click on the format. There are a number of different formats here. I can export this just as an audio file. I can export this as QuickTime or TIFF or anything like that. But typically H.264 is the one you want. I wouldn't change that actually. I would just leave that as it is. H.264 is a very high res but also very lightweight of rendering. For the preset, let's go back here. Let's look at all of these and let's say we want to post to YouTube. And so I'm going to post this at 1080 full HD on YouTube. So let's go ahead and click on that and we'll hit OK. Under output file, we can choose where we want to save this. I'll just save this like in my downloads folder for right now. So once all this is set, and I kind of glossed over this, there are a number of other settings here related to audio and whether or not you want to export the audio or whether you want it to be silent, whether you want to use maximum render quality. These are some things that you can look into a little bit further, but for now, this will work as it is. So the last thing to do is simply to go ahead and render it, which you do by pressing this play button here. And this is a short video, so that rendered out pretty quickly. We can go into our file now, go to our downloads, and here is our video. Boom. So that is animating the ephemeral and atmospheric and meteorological aspects of landscape. And if there are any questions, you can email me. If you're watching this video and you're not in the class at University of Virginia, you can post questions in the comments and I might see them. But yeah, we'll see you next time. Okay, bye.